The chilly autumn wind swept through the quiet streets as Shanice pulled her worn denim jacket tighter around her shoulders. Her feet were killing her after an 8-hour shift at Jerry's diner, where the constant running between tables had left her exhausted. But she kept walking. Nursing school wasn't going to pay for itself, and these late-night shifts were her ticket to a better future. The streetlights cast long shadows across the well-maintained lawns of Oak Ridge, a neighborhood where she always felt like an outsider. Most of the time, Shanice took the longer route home to avoid the stairs, but tonight was different. Her legs were too tired, and the shorter path through these expensive homes seemed worth the discomfort. That's when she heard it, a faint whimper that made her stop in her tracks. At first, she thought it might be a cat, but then she heard it again, this time clearer. It was human. Following the sound, Shanice noticed an elderly white woman lying awkwardly on her front porch, one hand clutching her hip, the other trying to reach the doorbell that was just beyond her grasp. The woman's silver hair was disheveled, and her gardening tools lay scattered around her. Shanice hesitated for a moment. She'd had enough experiences with people assuming the worst about her simply because of her skin color. Just last week, a customer at the diner had clutched her purse tighter when Shanice approached to take her order. But something in the woman's pained expression pushed those thoughts aside. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" Shanice called out, keeping her voice gentle and calm. The woman turned her head, and Shanice could see the mixture of relief and uncertainty in her eyes. I slipped," she managed to say, her voice shaking. "My hip." Without further hesitation, Shanice rushed up the porch steps, her tired feet forgotten. As she got closer, she could smell the fresh earth from the garden and see the woman's muddied clothes. She must have been tending to her flowers when she fell. "I'm Shanice," she said softly, kneeling beside the woman. "I'm a nursing student. Let me help you, okay? Try not to move. We need to make sure nothing's broken." The woman nodded, relaxing slightly at the mention of nursing school. "I'm Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Whitman. I've lived here for 40 years, and now my own garden tries to kill me." She attempted a weak laugh that turned into a grimace. Shanice quickly but carefully checked Margaret's vital signs, just as she'd learned in school. "I'm going to call an ambulance, Mrs. Whitman. Is your door unlocked? We should get your insurance card and any medications you're taking." "Top drawer in the kitchen," Margaret said, then added hesitantly, "The spare key is under that ugly ceramic frog my daughter gave me. I've been meaning to throw it out for years." As Shanice called 911, she noticed Margaret shivering in the evening air. Without thinking twice, she took off her own jacket and draped it over the elderly woman. Margaret looked surprised by the gesture, and for a moment, their eyes met. Something passed between them, a simple human connection that transcended the invisible barriers society had placed between them. While they waited for the ambulance, Shanice held Margaret's hand and asked about her garden, keeping her talking and conscious. She learned that the pink roses were planted when Margaret's first grandchild was born, and the tomato plants were her late husband's pride and joy. When the ambulance finally arrived, its red and blue lights painting the peaceful street in urgent colors, neighbors began peeking out their windows. Shanice could feel their stares as she helped the paramedics lift Margaret onto the stretcher, but for once she didn't care. All that mattered was making sure this kind woman, who trusted a stranger with her spare key and shared stories about her roses, would be okay. As they loaded Margaret into the ambulance, she grabbed Shanice's hand. "Thank you," she said, her eyes bright with tears. Most people would have just walked by. "I'll check on your garden tomorrow," Shanice promised, surprising herself. Those tomatoes looked like they needed water. Neither woman knew it then, but this chance encounter on a quiet evening would change both their lives forever. Sometimes, the greatest stories begin not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness between two people who were brave enough to see past their differences. The hospital room was unusually quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors when Shanice walked in, carrying a warm container of homemade chicken soup. It had been 3 days since she found Margaret on her porch, and something kept pulling her back to check on the elderly woman. "You didn't have to come again," Margaret said, her face lighting up despite her words. She was sitting up in bed now, looking better than she had on that first night, though still pale against the white hospital sheets. "Well, someone had to save you from this hospital food," Shanice replied, pulling up a chair. "Plus, I promised I'd tell you how your garden's doing. Those tomatoes are starting to ripen, by the way." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You actually went back to water my garden." "Of course I did. A promise is a promise." Shanice opened the soup container, and the warm aroma filled the sterile room. "My grandma's recipe. She always said good soup fixes everything from a broken bone to a broken heart." As Shanice helped Margaret with the soup, they talked. Really talked. Not the polite, surface-level chat of strangers, but the kind of conversation that happens when two people realize they have more in common than they thought. "My husband Robert used to make soup too," Margaret shared, her voice soft with memory. "Not as good as this, mind you, but he tried. Passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack while working in that garden of his." Shanice squeezed Margaret's hand. "I lost my parents 3 years ago. Car accident. Been taking care of my little sister ever since." "That's why you work at the diner. And nursing school." "Yeah, day classes, night shifts, and somehow squeezing in study time between. But we're making it work." Shanice straightened Margaret's blanket, a habit from her nursing training. "My mom always said education is the one thing nobody can take from you." The nurses started noticing Shanice's regular visits. At first, they watched her carefully, especially Nancy, the head nurse who'd been at the hospital for 20 years. But soon, they saw how Margaret's whole demeanor changed when Shanice was around. How she ate better, laughed more, and even did her physical therapy exercises without complaining. One evening, Nancy pulled Shanice aside. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Mrs. Whitman's recovery has improved significantly since you started visiting." What surprised everyone most was how natural their friendship felt. They swapped stories. Margaret about her younger days as a teacher, Shanice about her dreams of becoming a nurse practitioner. They did crossword puzzles together, something Margaret loved but could never convince her busy children to do with her. 4 letters, family but not by blood. Margaret read from the puzzle one afternoon. "Bond," Shanice answered without hesitation. Margaret looked up at her, something deep and thoughtful in her expression. "Yes, that's exactly right." The hospital staff began to joke that Shanice spent more time in room 315 than some of their nurses. But what they didn't see were the quiet moments. Like when Margaret showed Shanice old photos of her civil rights days, marching for equality in the 60s, or when Shanice confided her fears about failing her upcoming nursing exams. "You know," Margaret said one evening, picking at her hospital blanket, "my children used to visit every Sunday when Robert was alive. Now they're all too busy. Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. That's what family has become these days." Shanice thought about her own small family, just her and her sister, and how they made sure to have dinner together at least 3 times a week, no matter how crazy their schedules got. "Sometimes the family we choose is more precious than the family we're born into," she said softly. Margaret reached for Shanice's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone recovering from a fall. "Would you believe some people have asked me why I let you visit so much? As if kindness needs to match skin color." "Let them talk," Shanice said firmly. "Good hearts recognize each other, no matter what package they come in." And in that moment, both women knew they'd found something rare and precious, a friendship that didn't care about age, race, or what anyone else thought. Sometimes life's biggest blessings come disguised as accidents even painful ones, like a fall on a front porch on a quiet evening. The summer heat was just starting to fade when Margaret finally came home from the hospital. Shanice had spent the morning making sure everything was perfect, cleaning the house, arranging Margaret's medications on the kitchen counter, and even putting fresh flowers from the garden in every room. "You didn't have to do all this," Margaret said as she slowly made her way through her front door with her walker. But her eyes sparkled at the sight of her clean, welcoming home. "Look who's talking," Shanice replied, setting down Margaret's hospital bag. "You're the one who offered to help pay for my nursing school when you found out about my student loans." Margaret settled into her favorite armchair, the one with the worn armrests and the view of her beloved garden. "Well, what's the point of having savings if you can't help someone worthy? My own children have more than enough." That's when they heard a car door slam outside. Through the window, they saw an expensive black SUV parked in the driveway. A well-dressed woman in her 40s marched up the walkway, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Oh Lord," Margaret muttered. "That's my daughter Patricia. Someone must have told her I'm home." The front door burst open before Shanice could respond. Patricia stood there, designer handbag clutched tight, taking in the scene before her. Her eyes narrowed when she saw Shanice. "Mom, why didn't you tell me you were being discharged today? And who is this?" The way she said this made it sound like she'd found a stranger rifling through their belongings. "This is Shanice," Margaret said firmly. "She's the angel who found me when I fell and has been helping me ever since. Where were you, by the way? I left 3 messages." Patricia's face flushed. "I've been busy with the kids' summer activities. You know how it is. But that's not important right now. Who exactly are you?" She turned to Shanice, her tone sharp. "And why are you in my mother's house?" Shanice straightened her back, maintaining her composure like she did with difficult patients at the hospital. "I'm a nursing student, and I've been helping your mother recover. We've become good friends." "Friends?" Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, you can't be serious. Do you know how this looks? A young stranger suddenly becoming best friends with a wealthy widow." "Patricia Ann Wilson." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. "I raised you better than this. Shanice has shown me more care and companionship in these past few months than I've seen from you in years. She waters my garden, brings me soup, and actually listens when I talk. I'm just trying to protect you, Mom. You're vulnerable right now, and there are people who might take advantage. The only thing I'm vulnerable to is dying of loneliness if I had to depend on my children's occasional visits." Margaret cut in. "Shanice saved my life, and not just by calling the ambulance that night. She gave me something to look forward to every day." Shanice quietly gathered her things. "I should go. You two need to talk." "No." Margaret's hand shot out, catching Shanice's wrist. "You stay right here. Patricia, if you can't be civil to my friend, then maybe you should come back when you can." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked between her mother and Shanice, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed out. The SUV's engine roared to life, and soon the sound of tires on gravel faded away. "I'm so sorry," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "That's not how I wanted you to meet my family." Shanice sat down next to Margaret's chair, taking her hand. "Hey, it's okay. I've dealt with worse at the diner. Remember that customer who accused me of overcharging him by 50 cents? Margaret chuckled despite herself. "You handled that with grace too. That's what I love about you, Shanice. You don't let the ugliness in others dim your light. My mama always said that hurt people hurt people. Your daughter's probably just scared of losing you." "Maybe," Margaret sighed. "But she needs to understand that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who makes the effort to really know you." They sat together as the afternoon light painted the living room golden, 2 women from different worlds who had found in each other the family they both needed. Sometimes, Shanice thought, the best families are the ones we build ourselves, one act of kindness at a time. After Patricia's dramatic visit, things got complicated. Phone calls started pouring in from Margaret's other children. First from her son Thomas in California, then her youngest daughter Linda from Seattle. Word had spread fast, and none of them were happy about their mother's new friendship. They're having a family meeting, Margaret told Shanice one morning as they sat on the porch drinking tea. Flying in this weekend to discuss the situation. Can you believe it? They haven't all been here together since Robert's funeral. Shanice watched a hummingbird dart between the flowers they planted together. Maybe it's good they're coming. They can see for themselves that you're doing well. Doing well? Margaret laughed. I'm doing better than I have in years. Yesterday, I made it all the way to the mailbox and back without my walker. The weekend arrived too quickly. Shanice had offered to stay away, but Margaret wouldn't hear of it. You're part of my life now, she'd said stubbornly. They'll just have to deal with it. When the doorbell rang that Saturday morning, Margaret's living room was already full of tension. Thomas, a businessman with graying temples, paced by the window. Linda sat perched on the edge of the sofa, tapping away at her phone. Patricia stood guard by their mother's chair like a sentinel. Shanice walked in carrying a fresh batch of her famous cinnamon rolls, Margaret's favorite. The room fell silent. Oh, thank goodness, Margaret said, breaking the awkward quiet. I was hoping you'd bring those. Everyone, this is Shanice. Shanice, meet my children, though they're not acting very childlike at the moment. What exactly are your intentions with our mother? Thomas asked bluntly, ignoring the introduction. Shanice set down the cinnamon rolls carefully. My intention is to be her friend. That's all it's ever been. Friend? Linda finally looked up from her phone. Mom's writing you checks for nursing school. That's not friendship, that's taking advantage. I never asked for that money, Shanice said quietly. Your mother offered because she believes in education. I tried to refuse. Oh, I'm sure you did, Patricia muttered. Margaret's teacup clattered against its saucer. That's enough. I'm not some senile old woman being taken advantage of. I'm making my own choices about my own money. Mom, Thomas stepped forward, all business. We're just concerned. You have to admit this looks unusual. A young woman suddenly becoming best friends with a wealthy widow. Unusual? Margaret's voice shook with anger. You want to talk about unusual? How about children who only call on holidays? Who were too busy to visit their mother in the hospital? Who didn't even notice when I stopped tending to their father's beloved garden because I was too depressed to go outside? The room grew very still. Margaret rarely talked about the dark days after Robert died. Shanice noticed. Margaret continued, softer now. She didn't just help me up when I fell. She helped me want to live again. She listens to my stories, laughs at my silly jokes, makes sure I take my medicine. She's not after my money. She's after my happiness. Can any of you say the same? Linda's phone slipped from her hands. Patricia's stern expression cracked slightly. Thomas stopped pacing. Do you know what she did with the money I gave her for school? Margaret asked. She used part of it to hire a gardener to maintain the yard while I was in the hospital. Said she couldn't bear to see your father's tomatoes die. Shanice felt tears burning in her eyes. She hadn't known Margaret knew about that. But Mom, Patricia tried one last time. What will people think? I don't care what people think, Margaret said firmly. I care what's in a person's heart. And Shanice has shown me her heart every single day since we met. Now, who wants a cinnamon roll? They're still warm. The tension in the room didn't completely disappear, but it shifted. Linda picked up her phone, then put it down again. Thomas sat down heavily in a chair. Patricia, after a long moment, reached for a cinnamon roll. Sometimes, Shanice thought, watching Margaret's children struggle with this new reality, love asks us to be brave. brave enough to cross boundaries, to challenge assumptions, to choose kindness over judgment. As she watched Margaret serve her famous tea in her best china cups, she saw a woman who had chosen to be brave, who had decided that family could mean more than blood, that love could bridge any gap, even the ones we think are too wide to cross. As autumn painted the trees in brilliant colors, Margaret and Shanice's friendship continued to grow deeper. One crisp morning, they sat in Margaret's kitchen, the sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the garden they'd brought back to life together. "I want to show you something," Margaret said, pulling out an old photo album from a dusty shelf. "I've been meaning to share this with someone who'd understand." Inside were photographs that made Shanice's breath catch. Young Margaret marching with protesters in the 1960s, holding signs demanding equality. Her hair was dark then, her face determined, standing proudly alongside people of all races. "Most people don't know this part of my story," Margaret said softly, touching a faded photograph. "I was a teacher back then. Lost my job because I insisted on teaching the truth about civil rights in my classroom. That's where I met Robert. He was the only other teacher who stood up for what was right." Shanice squeezed Margaret's hand. "You were so brave." "Brave? Maybe. Angry? Definitely. My own parents didn't speak to me for 2 years after I joined the protests." Margaret turned another page. "But you know what? Some things are worth fighting for. Like dignity, respect, the right to be seen as a human being." Later that day, Shanice brought her younger sister Tanya over for dinner. At 16, Tanya was shy at first, but Margaret knew exactly how to make her comfortable. "Would you like to see my record collection?" Margaret asked, leading Tanya to the living room. "Your sister tells me you're interested in music." Soon, the house was filled with the sound of classic jazz, and Tanya was sitting cross-legged on the floor, carefully handling Margaret's vinyl collection. "These are amazing. Some of these must be worth a fortune." "Music doesn't care about fortune," Margaret smiled. "It cares about soul. Just like people should." They started having regular Sunday dinners together. Margaret, Shanice, and Tanya. Sometimes they cooked traditional Southern recipes passed down through Shanice's family. Other times, Margaret taught them Robert's secret pasta sauce recipe. The kitchen always smelled of good food and echoed with laughter. One evening, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Margaret watched Tanya helping Shanice with the dishes. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this house hasn't felt this alive in years. After Robert died, I thought I was just waiting around to join him. But now? Now you're stuck with us," Shanice grinned, flicking soap suds at her sister. "More like blessed with you," Margaret corrected. She pulled out an old jewelry box from a drawer. "Speaking of which, I want you to have this, Shanice." Inside was a beautiful pearl necklace. "I can't accept this," Shanice protested. "You can, and you will. My mother gave it to me when I graduated college. I always hoped to pass it on to someone who'd understand its meaning, that education and dignity go hand in hand." Tears welled up in Shanice's eyes as Margaret fastened the necklace around her neck. Tanya watched, smiling, understanding the significance of the moment. "My children think I'm being foolish," Margaret continued. "They don't understand that sometimes God sends us exactly who we need, exactly when we need them. You two have given me back my purpose." They spent the rest of the evening looking through more old photographs. Margaret shared stories about each one. Her first teaching job, the day she met Robert, the protests that changed her life. Shanice and Tanya shared their own stories, memories of their parents, their dreams for the future. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, Margaret watched the two sisters laughing over an old picture of her in bell-bottoms. Her heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Some people might not understand this unlikely family they created, but Margaret knew better. Love doesn't follow rules or expectations. It follows the heart. and her heart had led her to these two young women who had brought light back into her life. In them, she saw echoes of her own younger self, the same determination, the same hope for a better world. In them, she saw the future she had fought for all those years ago. Winter came early that year, bringing with it an unexpected chill that seemed to settle deep into Margaret's bones. At first, she tried to hide it, but Shanice noticed how Margaret moved more slowly, how she needed her walker again, how she sometimes struggled to catch her breath. "You're going to the doctor," Shanice insisted one morning after finding Margaret sitting in her chair, looking more tired than usual. No arguments. "You're worse than my own mother used to be," Margaret grumbled, but her smile was weak. "Though I suppose that's why you'll make such a good nurse." The doctor's office was busy that day. Shanice sat next to Margaret in the waiting room, holding her hand as they waited. When the nurse called Margaret's name, she wouldn't let Shanice come back with her at first. "She's family," Margaret said firmly. The nurse looked between them, confusion crossing her face, but Margaret's tone left no room for argument. The examination took longer than expected. Too long. Shanice watched the doctor's face carefully. She'd learned enough in nursing school to recognize when medical professionals were trying to soften bad news. "We need to run some tests," the doctor finally said, his voice gentle. "There are some irregularities in your heart rhythm, Mrs. Whitman, and your breathing difficulties concern me." Margaret squeezed Shanice's hand. "Just tell me straight, doctor. I'm too old for sugarcoating." The next few weeks became a blur of hospital visits, tests, and worried conversations with specialists. Shanice rearranged her class schedule to drive Margaret to every appointment. She took detailed notes, asked questions the doctors sometimes seemed surprised to hear, and made sure Margaret understood all her options. "You don't have to do all this," Margaret said one evening as they sat in her living room, a pile of medical papers spread out between them. "You have your own life, your studies, your sister to think about." "You are my life," Shanice replied simply. "You and Tanya. You're my family, and family shows up." That night, after Shanice went home, Margaret sat alone in her study for a long time. Finally, she picked up the phone and called her lawyer. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling stronger than she had in days. "Let's go somewhere," she announced when Shanice arrived to check on her. "Are you sure that's wise?" Shanice asked, worried about Margaret's health. "Wisdom is overrated. Get your sister, and let's go to the art gallery downtown. There's an exhibit I've been wanting to see." They spent the whole day together. Margaret insisted on treating them to lunch at a fancy restaurant where the waiter raised his eyebrows at the unusual group, but quickly warmed to Margaret's charm. They wandered through the art gallery, with Margaret sharing stories about each painting that caught their eye. "Art is like life," she told them, standing before a particularly colorful abstract piece. "Sometimes it doesn't make sense at first glance, but if you look with your heart instead of your eyes, you find the beauty in unexpected places." By late afternoon, Margaret was exhausted but happy. As they helped her into the house, she paused in the doorway. "Thank you for today, both of you. You've given an old woman something precious." "Stop talking like that," Shanice said, trying to keep her voice light despite the worry in her chest. "You're not that old." Margaret just smiled, that knowing smile that meant she understood more than she was saying. "Life doesn't always give us what we expect, does it? Sometimes it gives us something better." That night, Margaret sat at her desk and wrote 3 letters, one for each of her biological children. Then she wrote a 4th letter, this one longer than the others. When she finished, she sealed them all in envelopes and placed them in her desk drawer. Looking out her window at the night sky, she thought about love and family and all the different ways people find their way to each other. She thought about a young woman who stopped to help a stranger on a porch and how that one moment had changed everything. Margaret went to bed that night with a peaceful heart, knowing she had done what needed to be done. Sometimes She thought as she drifted off to sleep, the greatest gift we can give is to recognize love when it comes to us, even if it comes in unexpected ways. The call came at 3 a.m. Shanice was just finishing a late-night study session for her nursing finals when her phone lit up with the hospital's number. Margaret had been rushed to the emergency room after her neighbor found her unresponsive. Shanice's hands shook as she drove to the hospital, every red light feeling like an eternity. When she arrived, the emergency room was quiet except for the usual beeping of machines and soft footsteps of night shift nurses. "Family only," the nurse at the desk said without looking up. "Sheeta's family," came a voice behind them. It was Patricia, Margaret's daughter, looking tired and worried. "Let her through." Shanice turned, surprised by Patricia's presence and even more by her words. Their eyes met for a moment, understanding passing between them. Sometimes it takes a crisis to show us what really matters. Margaret looked small in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped steadily. The doctor explained that she had suffered a major heart attack. They'd stabilized her, but the next 24 hours would be critical. Patricia and Shanice took turns sitting with Margaret through the night. Around dawn, Thomas and Linda arrived, having caught the first flights they could. The siblings gathered in the hallway, talking in hushed voices. "Did any of you know she was this sick?" Linda asked, her makeup smeared from crying. "Shanice did," Thomas said quietly. "She's been taking Mom to all her appointments." The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky when Margaret opened her eyes. She looked at each face gathered around her bed and managed a weak smile. "My children," she whispered. "All my children." Later that day, Margaret's lawyer arrived at the hospital. He was carrying an envelope that made Patricia's eyes narrow with suspicion. But before anyone could say anything, Margaret spoke up from her bed. "It's time," she said softly. "Richard, please read the letters." The lawyer pulled out 4 envelopes. The first 3 were for Patricia, Thomas, and Linda. The 4th, thicker envelope was marked "to be read last." As each child read their letter, tears began to fall. Margaret had written to each of them about her life, her loves, her regrets. She reminded them of happy memories. Thomas learning to ride a bike, Patricia's first dance recital, Linda's high school graduation. She forgave them for their absence in her later years, understanding that life sometimes pulls us in different directions. Then came the last letter. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. "To whom it may concern, I, Margaret Eleanor Whitman, being of sound mind, declare this to be my last will and testament." The room grew very quiet. Margaret had left specific instructions. While her children would receive their father's inheritance as planned, her own substantial estate, including the house, her savings, and most of her personal belongings, would go to Shanice. "Mom, you can't be serious," Linda started, but Margaret raised her hand weakly. "I've never been more serious," she said. "When I fell that day on my porch, I thought it was the end. Instead, it was a beginning. Shanice didn't just help me up, she helped me live again. She showed me that family isn't about obligation. It's about love, pure and simple." She turned to Shanice, who was crying quietly in the corner. "You never asked for anything except to be my friend. You gave me back my joy, my purpose. You and Tanya became the daughters of my heart." Patricia stood up suddenly, surprising everyone. She walked over to Shanice and did something no one expected. She hugged her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for loving our mother when we forgot how." The lawyer continued reading, explaining how Margaret had set up a trust for Shanice's nursing education and a separate fund for Tanya's future college expenses. She had also left instructions for the house to become a community center, offering education programs for underprivileged students. "Life taught me that love doesn't follow rules," Margaret's letter concluded. "It breaks barriers, crosses boundaries, and finds us exactly when we need it most." Shanice and Tanya reminded me of who I used to be, a woman who fought for what was right, who believed in the power of education, who saw beyond the surface to the heart beneath. They became my legacy, living proof that family is about more than blood. The peace after Margaret's will reading didn't last long. 3 days after she returned home from the hospital, the legal papers arrived. Margaret's children were contesting the will. "They're saying I manipulated you," Shanice told Margaret, her voice shaking as she read the legal documents at Margaret's kitchen table. "That I took advantage of your vulnerability after your fall." Margaret, still weak but sitting up in her favorite chair, reached for Shanice's hand. "Let them try. Truth has a way of coming to light." The lawyers their children hired were expensive and aggressive. They dug into Shanice's past, looking for anything they could use against her. They interviewed neighbors, questioning them about the unusual friendship between the elderly white woman and the young black nursing student. But they didn't expect what they found. Mrs. Chen from next door told them about how Shanice would shovel Margaret's driveway in winter before heading to her morning classes. The local pharmacist spoke about how Shanice would double-check Margaret's medications, catching a potentially dangerous interaction that even the doctors had missed. Dr. Williams, Margaret's primary physician, testified about Shanice's dedication during Margaret's appointments. "In 30 years of practice," he stated firmly, "I've rarely seen such genuine care between any family members, let alone people who aren't related by blood." Then came Nancy, the head nurse from the hospital during Margaret's first stay. She brought records of every visit, showing how Shanice had spent her breaks between classes sitting with Margaret, helping with physical therapy, making sure she ate properly. "You want to know if this young woman took advantage?" Nancy asked the lawyers. "She took advantage of every opportunity to help, to learn, to show kindness. If that's manipulation, we could use more of it in this world." The local diner owner, where Shanice Word testified about her picking up extra shifts to buy seeds for Margaret's garden. She said Mrs. Whitman missed her husband's tomatoes, he recalled. Spent her own money to keep that garden alive while the old lady was in the hospital. But the most powerful testimony came from Reverend Johnson, who had known Margaret for 40 years. He brought photographs from the 1960s. Young Margaret marching for civil rights, teaching in integrated schools when many refused. "Margaret Whitman has always seen people's hearts, not their skin color," he testified. "She lost friends, family relationships, even her teaching job because she stood up for what was right. This isn't some sudden change of character. This is who she's always been." The legal battle dragged on for weeks. Margaret grew weaker, but her spirit remained strong. Every time the lawyers presented a new argument, she had an answer ready. "You say Shanice manipulated me into changing my will?" Margaret challenged them during one deposition. "I changed it because she reminded me of who I am. When my own children were too busy for Sunday dinners, she and her sister made sure I never ate alone. When they were too occupied to call, she read me the newspaper every morning. She didn't do these things for money. She did them because that's who she is." Then came the surprise testimony. Patricia, Margaret's eldest daughter, stood up in court. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice carrying through the quiet courtroom. "We all were. We saw what we expected to see, a young woman taking advantage of our mother. We didn't see what was really happening, someone loving our mother the way we should have." She turned to face the judge directly. "My mother isn't being manipulated. She's teaching us one last lesson about love and family, and we're finally learning it." The judge listened to every testimony, reviewed every document. Finally, after weeks of hearings, she made her decision. "This court finds no evidence of manipulation or undue influence," she declared. "Instead, we find overwhelming evidence of a genuine relationship built on mutual respect, care, and love. The will stands as written." In that moment, as tears rolled down Shanice's cheeks, she felt Margaret squeeze her hand. Sometimes, justice isn't just about the law. Sometimes, it's about recognizing love in all its unexpected forms. 5 years after the court battle, Margaret's old Victorian house had transformed into something beautiful. The sign at the front gate read, "The Margaret Whitman Community Center for Education and Unity." The garden, once Robert's pride and joy, now sprawled across the entire yard, filled with vegetables and flowers tended by local students. Shanice, now a registered nurse practitioner, stood in what used to be Margaret's living room, watching a group of teenagers hunched over their textbooks. The pearl necklace Margaret had given her caught the afternoon light as she moved between the study tables, helping students with their homework. "Miss Shanice," a young girl called out, "can you help me with this biology question? I want to be a nurse too." Shanice smiled, remembering her own dreams and the woman who helped make them possible. Margaret had lived to see Shanice graduate from nursing school, sitting proudly in the front row despite her wheelchair. She even lived long enough to see the community center's opening day, cutting the ribbon with shaking hands but bright eyes. "You've made it everything I dreamed it could be," Margaret had whispered that day, watching neighborhood kids of all backgrounds playing together in her garden. Now, 3 years after Margaret's peaceful passing, her legacy lived on in ways even she might not have imagined. The center offered free tutoring, college preparation classes, and scholarships for underprivileged students. Tanya, now in college herself, ran summer art programs in the converted sunroom. The doorbell rang. It was Patricia, right on time for her weekly volunteer session. After the court battle, Margaret's children had slowly found their way back, not just to their mother's memory, but to a new understanding of what family could mean. "The garden looks amazing," Patricia said, setting down her bag. She now taught weekend gardening classes, sharing her father's love of growing things with a new generation. "Dad would have loved this." "Margaret would have too," Shanice replied softly. They shared a knowing look, remembering the woman who had brought them all together. In Margaret's old study, now a small library, hung photographs telling their story. Margaret and Robert at their wedding. Young Margaret at civil rights marches. Margaret and Shanice in the garden. The whole extended family, biological and chosen, at the center's opening. Each picture was a chapter in a story about love breaking down barriers. That evening, after the students had gone home, Shanice sat in Margaret's old chair, looking out at the garden where their story had begun. She pulled out a worn envelope, the last letter Margaret had written her, found after her passing. "My dearest Shanice," it read, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. But what we built together will live on. You didn't just inherit my house or my money. You inherited my dream of a world where love knows no boundaries, where family is defined by the heart, not by blood or color, where one simple act of kindness can change everything. I've watched you grow from a kind young woman who stopped to help a fallen stranger into a strong, compassionate nurse who heals more than just bodies. You heal hearts. You and Tanya became the daughters I always needed, and through you, my own children learned to open their hearts again. Remember that fall on the porch? I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to me. Instead, it brought me my greatest blessing. That's how life works sometimes. Our biggest challenges can become our biggest gifts. Keep the center growing. Keep teaching young people that love is stronger than prejudice. Keep sharing your light with the world. And whenever you miss me, just look in the garden. I'll be there in every flower that blooms, in every life that's changed, in every barrier that's broken. With all my love, Margaret. Shanice folded the letter carefully, wiping away tears. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in the same colors as that evening years ago, when she'd first stopped to help a fallen stranger. In the garden, new flowers were blooming, tomorrow's students would come to learn, and Margaret's dream of unity would continue to grow. Sometimes the most beautiful stories don't end. They just keep growing, like flowers in a well-tended garden, touching more lives with each passing season.